The first $1,000 is not hard because the number is large. It is hard because you are trying to lift money out of gravity with your bare hands. Most people never understand that. They think they have a discipline problem. They think they have an income problem. They think they missed some secret gene that wealthy people were born with. They think the people who build wealth must be calmer, smarter, luckier, or somehow less tempted by ordinary life. I do not believe that. I think most people are standing at the bottom of a financial gravity well and calling it normal. That is the real problem. At the bottom of a gravity well, every dollar is heavy. Every small decision feels emotional. Every emergency feels like proof that you were never supposed to get ahead in the first place. Every attempt to save feels like self-denial. Every sacrifice feels visible. Every gain feels too small to matter. And because the gain feels too small, the brain keeps asking the same humiliating question. Why am I suffering for something that barely moves? That is why the first $1,000 feels impossible. It is not just money, it is resistance. I want you to understand the brutality of that resistance, because if you misdiagnose it, you will spend years blaming the wrong enemy. The enemy is not only your paycheck, the enemy is not only your expenses, the enemy is not only your debt, the enemy is the entire system that teaches your brain to worship immediate relief and distrust delayed freedom. The source document circles this hard from the start. It says, the difficulty of the first $1,000 is rooted not just in arithmetic but in psychology, especially the way your brain values immediate rewards more than future benefits, a force it explicitly calls temporal discounting. It also says the first breakthrough matters because once you cross it, the next $10,000 tends to come faster, not slower. Fayfalicite Fayturn 76 File 0 Fay, that is exactly right. Your brain was not built to make you wealthy. It was built to keep you alive in a world that no longer exists. For most of human history, immediate resources mattered more than long-term plans. Food now was better than food later. Shelter now was better than shelter later. A sure thing in the hand was better than a possible advantage months away. Your biology still lives inside that old logic. So when you try to save money, your brain does not congratulate you for strategic maturity. It treats the act as a suspicious refusal of immediate relief. It behaves as though you are withholding survival from yourself. That is why spending $50 tonight feels vivid, while saving $50 for some future version of yourself feels thin and abstract. The source puts this plainly when it contrasts a dinner tonight with saving the same amount for a distant self that feels emotionally unreal. Fayfalicite Fayturn 76 File 0 Fay, this is not a character defect. It is old software, but old software still ruins modern people every day. Then the problem gets worse, because your money is not just trapped in biological gravity, it is also trapped in psychological sorting errors. The source talks about the house money effect, which is a polite phrase for a childish habit. Money gets mentally sorted according to where it came from. Earned money feels heavy. Unexpected money feels like play money. Tax refunds feel loose. Gift money feels unserious. Cash found in a jacket feels invisible. Fayfalicite Fayturn 76 File 0 Fay. I have watched people behave with absurd inconsistency because of this. They say they cannot save. Then they waste a refund. They say they are trying to build security. Then they burn gift money on nonsense because it didn't really count. That is what gravity does. It makes your money feel different depending on the story around it, rather than the function it serves. I do not allow that kind of thinking. A dollar is a worker. If it enters your life and you fail to assign it, the gravity field will assign it for you. Then there are the money scripts. The source is right to bring them in. It points to the way childhood beliefs about money get buried so deeply that they begin making adult decisions without permission. Maybe money meant conflict in your home. Maybe it meant shame. Maybe it meant people saying, we can afford that, until your identity fused with limitation. Maybe nobody discussed money at all. So wealth started to feel strange, impolite, or morally suspicious. Fayfalicite Fayturn 76 File 0 Fay. I call these scripts anchor chains. You may think you are trying to save your first $1,000. In reality, you may be trying to outrun a sentence planted in your head at age 10. That is why some people sabotage themselves every time progress starts. The first few $100s appear, then a deserved treat shows up, then a weekend purchase, then an emotional convenience, then a small surrender disguised as balance. They do not realize they are obeying an old script. Their present is being priced by a sentence from the past. If you do not cut those anchor chains, you will keep calling your own sabotage bad luck. Now let us get even more honest. The first $1,000 is hard because scarcity changes the meaning of time. When you have no savings, money is not an abstract score. It is oxygen, it is rent, it is groceries. It is the repair you hope does not happen. It is the overdue bill you are strategically ignoring. It is the gap between whether a flat tire is annoying or catastrophic. That means every dollar you save is competing with fear, and fear bids aggressively. This is why I do not laugh at the person who says, saving even $100 feels impossible. The source uses that exact monthly figure in its math example and says it takes 10 months to save the first $1,000 at that rate. 10 months of saying no, 10 months of visible restraint, 10 months during which the balance still looks too small to change your life. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. That is a miserable phase for weak people. Because the beginning of wealth is the phase where effort is obvious and proof is tiny. You feel all the friction, but almost none of the power. That is the cruelty of launch. I call it dead weight season and dead weight season. You are doing all the lifting yourself. The source makes this point directly. It says the first $1,000 is almost entirely dependent on behavior and on spending less than you earn. Because at that size, the money is not yet doing much work for you. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay that matters. Because if you misunderstand the early phase, you quit exactly when quitting is most destructive. Most people look at their account after several months and say this isn't working. That statement is almost always false. What they mean is, this is not emotionally rewarding quickly enough. Those are not the same sentence. Wealth does not begin as emotional reward. It begins as evidence of control. That is why the first $1,000 changes everything psychologically once it is real. The source introduces self-efficacy here, and that idea matters more than most people realize. It says that when you have never saved anything, $10,000 feels impossible because your brain cannot picture you as the kind of person who gets there. But once you save the first $1,000, something rewrites. Your mind finally has proof that you can do this at all. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. I would state it more brutally. The first $1,000 is not just saved cash. It is identity evidence. Before that, wealth is theory. After that, wealth becomes biography. Now your brain has a memory it cannot dismiss. You have crossed a threshold. You have tangible proof that you can restrain yourself, direct cash, and survive without spending every spare dollar. That sounds small to foolish people. It is not small. It is a software patch. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries to save. You begin seeing yourself as someone who can. That shift is where gravity weakens. This is the part the public misses because the public is addicted to numbers and blind to identity. They think the value of the first $1,000 is the money itself. Wrong. The value is that you have established an inner scorecard event. You have evidence, you have a before and after, you have proof that your behavior is not fixed. The source says people who successfully save their first $1,000 are dramatically more likely to save the next one. That does not surprise me at all. Once the mind sees a rope, it climbs differently. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. Then the mathematics begin to stop insulting you. That is when the story changes. The source lays out a simple illustration. Save $100 a month, earn a basic 7% annual return. The first $1,000 takes 10 months. The second takes about 9. The third takes about 8.5. The fourth takes a little under 8. By the time you are pushing toward $10,000, each additional 1,000 takes under 6 months. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. Those numbers do not look dramatic enough to thrill a fool, but they tell you everything. They tell you the burden is shifting. They tell you you are no longer lifting alone. They tell you the machine has started to answer. This is where I want you to see the master metaphor clearly. Money behaves like mass under gravity until you reach escape velocity below escape velocity. Nearly everything is effort. You push, you sweat, you deny yourself, you look ridiculous to your friends, you feel no altitude. Every inch costs energy. Then once you have enough mass moving in the right direction, the same force that crushed you starts doing something else. Momentum appears, return appears, identity reinforcement appears, the emotional reward system flips. Saving begins to feel less like self-punishment and more like control. The source says exactly that in softer language. It says the same psychological mechanisms that once made saving feel impossible begin working for you once certain thresholds are crossed. It even describes the shift from checking balances with dread to checking them with excitement. Felicite Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. That is the flip. From deprivation to achievement, from effort to traction, from survival logic to ownership logic, from gravity to orbit. Now, I need to say something most personal finance people are too cowardly to say out loud. Many people do not have a math problem. They have a relief addiction. The source touches this when it talks about how spending is often emotional rather than financial. Lunch is not just lunch. It is a break from a job you hate. Shopping is not just shopping. It is dopamine inside a dead routine. Going out is not just socializing. It is loneliness management with a debit card. Fay file a site, Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. That is one of the hardest truths in wealth building. You cannot solve emotional leakage with arithmetic alone. You can show a person that a $5 weekday habit adds up to $1,300 a year. You can show them that invested at 7%. That stream can become roughly $18,000 in 10 years and more than $53,000 in 20. The source gives those exact numbers with coffee. As the example, Fay file a site, Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay, and what will happen? Nothing, unless the person understands what the purchase was doing emotionally. Because if coffee is not coffee, but anesthesia, then the equation is incomplete. If shopping is not shopping but self-soothing, then the spreadsheet is speaking the wrong language. If nights out are not nights out but rented belonging, then the sacrifice feels larger than the price tag. This is why the first $1,000 is so psychologically violent. You are not simply redirecting dollars, you are taking away little emotional crutches and asking your identity to walk differently. That is why I do not admire willpower very much. Willpower is a weak rope. It frays when the day is long and the week is humiliating. I prefer substitution. The source gets this too. It says people who make the transition successfully do not just stop spending. They replace the emotional reward. They learn to enjoy the gain in the account the way they used to enjoy the purchase. Fay file a site, Fay turn 76, file 0 Fay, that is wisdom. Because the mind needs a reward loop. If you do not replace one, the old one returns. So if you want the first $1,000 to stop feeling impossible, you must build a new pleasure circuit, not fake discipline, not self-punishment, not public virtue. You need a loop that makes progress itself feel good. I call that the traction loop. In the traction loop, you do not ask whether a purchase is cheap. You ask whether it steals momentum. You do not ask whether dinner out is deserved. You ask whether this dollar is fuel or friction. You do not ask whether you can technically afford something this month. You ask whether it lowers altitude. That change in questioning is how ordinary people become dangerous. Not because they become joyless, because they stop confusing immediate relief with progress. Now let us talk about what happens after $10,000, because this is where the source begins, showing the real emotional seduction of money working for you. At a basic 7% return, $10,000 throws off about $700 a year. The document points out that this is almost like getting 2 extra months of those $100 contributions without doing anything. At $20,000, the annual return becomes about $1,400 at $50,000, about $3,500. Fay file a site, Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. Think about what that means in plain English. At first you save money. Later, your money starts reheating your effort. Then eventually your money begins paying a noticeable fraction of the annual progress. And once you see that with your own eyes, something dangerous happens. You become harder to distract. That is when broke culture starts to lose its grip on you. Your friends still think in purchases. You begin thinking in acceleration. They still finance phones and call investing risky. The source mocks this contradiction directly. And rightly so, it describes people spending on drinks, finance gadgets, or daily convenience while claiming saving small amounts is impossible. Fay file a site, Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. I see that everywhere. People do not hate saving. They hate the stage before saving becomes visible power. They hate the launch pad. They hate the first year. They hate the feeling of smallness. They hate the fact that their broke friends can spend with more confidence than they can save. That is why the first $1,000 is harder than the next $10,000. The first $1,000 asks you to change before you have proof. The next $10,000 gives you proof while you are changing. That is a radically different fight. And once the proof begins appearing, your behavior starts to improve far beyond saving alone. The source notes that people who see progress begin paying attention to optimization, fees, taxes, income growth, and the long-term implications of small decisions. It says the psychological shift starts affecting how they spend time, not just money. Fay file a site, Fay turn 76 file 0 Fay. Of course it does, because wealth is not just stored money, it is stored options. The source says that too, and I agree with the line behind it with no savings. You take what you can get with real reserves. You begin buying choices rather than objects. You can tolerate risk better. You can leave a miserable job. You can invest in yourself. You can finally stop making every decision as though this month is the only month that matters. Fay Phalasite Fay Turn 76 File 0 Fay I call this choice density. Choice density increases as savings rise. A person with zero savings has almost no choice density. One surprise expense can wreck the month. One bad boss must be tolerated. One failed transmission can become a debt spiral. One opportunity requiring cash gets missed because there is nothing to deploy. A person with $10,000 has more breathing room. A person with $20,000 has more optionality. A person with $50,000 begins feeling the first real taste of refusal power. That is when the game changes again, because at that point, savings are not just protection, they are negotiation strength. When you can say no, the entire economy speaks to you differently. This is why I despise the lazy advice that tells people to just spend less without understanding why the spending exists and what the savings eventually become. The source is right to criticize that kind of advice. You cannot shame a person into durable wealth if you have not helped them replace the emotional engine underneath the behavior. Fay Phalasite Fay Turn 76 File 0 Fay, but I also despise something else. The endless softness that excuses every habit as self-care. Sometimes the brutal truth is needed. If you cannot save the first $1,000, you are not just underpaid. You are under command. Something else is running the switchboard. Your impulses are, your scripts are, your environment is, your pain is, your need to feel normal around careless people is. That is what must be confronted. Now let us deal with the larger claim near the end of the source because it is true enough to matter. It says the first $100,000 is the hardest. Not just because of compound interest, but because of the psychological transformation required to get there. It also says most people quit in the early brutal phase without realizing they are close to the breakthrough that changes everything. Fay Phalasite Fay Turn 76 File 0 Fay, that is a perfect description of how wealth compounds in the real world. First the behavior changes, then the identity changes, then the math becomes visible, then the behavior improves again because the math is visible, then the options widen, then the emotional dependence on spending begins to weaken, then the money starts doing enough work that the entire system begins feeding itself. That is not magic. That is compound psychology meeting compound money. Most people only understand the second part. That is why they stay stuck. They think compound interest alone will save them. It will not. Compound interest is useless to the person who cannot survive the launch. That is why the first $1,000 matters so much. It proves you can survive the launch. It proves you can stop obeying every urge. It proves your identity is not fixed. It proves you can carry discomfort without collapsing into a purchase. And once you prove that, the future stops feeling imaginary. Then comes the final trap. Once progress becomes real, many people start treating wealth as a scoreboard instead of a machine. They get addicted to the number and forget the deeper purpose. The source almost reaches the better conclusion when it says money is really about choices. Not stuff Fay Phalasite Fay Turn 76 File 0 Fay, that is the right line. Money is not interesting because it buys objects. Money is interesting because it lowers coercion. It buys time to think. It buys the right to wait. It buys the ability to refuse stupid work. It buys the chance to take a better risk. It buys the room to learn. It buys the gap between a bad month and a bad life. That is what your first $1,000 is trying to become. Not a flex, not a screenshot, not a number you mention to impress people who finance phones and call it confidence. It is the first crack in the gravity field, the first proof that your future will not be fully dictated by the loudest appetite in the room, the first piece of escape velocity. So let me leave you with a question that actually matters. When your next extra $50 appears, what are you going to call it? Dinner, play money, relief, or fuel? Because that answer tells me almost everything about where your life is headed. If you still see money as immediate permission, you will stay pinned close to the ground. If you start seeing money as mass you are trying to get into orbit, then the whole story changes. The first 1,000 will still hurt. It should. Launch is expensive. Gravity never gives way out of kindness. But once you break through, the same force that crushed you begins losing authority. Then the next $10,000 comes with less drama. Then the next threshold comes with more speed. Then the machine begins to answer. Then the future starts looking less like a threat and more like a structure you are actually building. Most people will never reach that point because they will surrender in dead weight season. They will say the process is too slow. They will say life is too expensive. They will say they deserve the coffee, the dinner, the little convenience, the emotional purchase, the harmless habit, the finance toy, the release, and then they will call their own stagnation. Bad luck. Do not join them. The first $1,000 is not a savings target. It is a test of whether you are willing to stop letting the oldest parts of your brain set the rules for the newest part of your future. So here is the door. You can keep living under scarcity gravity, spending to feel relief, and mistaking motion for progress. Or you can fight through the humiliating launch phase long enough to become the kind of person whose money finally starts lifting back. That is, the real threshold, not the number of the identity on the other side of it. And when your next paycheck arrives and the old instincts start shouting and your brain starts offering all the usual bargains, you need to ask one question with no softness at all. Am I feeding gravity again, or am I finally buying escape velocity?